In 1864, over 8,000 Navajos, many in tattered blankets and barefoot, were forced to the 3rd of March 50 miles through snow to Bosque Redondo, their sacred homeland left in ashes. A Navajo elder recalled, "We covered our faces and cried as soldiers slaughtered our sheep before our eyes." Historian Peter Iverson notes, "This was the fearing time, when their identity was shaken." How did the Navajo endure such loss to reclaim their land and spirit? Watch to uncover their story of resilience. In the 18th of January 64, the Navajo homeland trembled with landslides, shaking the earth beneath the feet of the Diné. These were no mere natural events but omens, as the Navajo saw them, heralding what they called the fearing time, a period of unprecedented suffering. Oral histories preserved by elders describe how the ground's unrest mirrored the turmoil soon to engulf their people. The Diné, who numbered around 12,000 in the mid-19th century, lived in a land they revered as sacred, and such signs were not ignored. Historian Jennifer Nez Denadale notes that these omens were woven into Navajo storytelling, serving as warnings of the trials to come. The landslides, cracking the red earth, set the stage for a tragedy that would test the resilience of a nation. Canyon de Chelly stood as the heart of Navajo resistance and spirituality, its towering red rock walls rising like sentinels over the canyon floor. By 1864, this sacred place, home to as many as 3,000 peach trees, was a refuge where Navajo families sought shelter. The Diné called it their mother, a place of comfort and protection, its sheer cliffs offering strategic defense against invaders. Navajo oral tradition, as recorded by anthropologist Ruth Underhill, describes the canyon as a living entity, its waters and stone imbued with spiritual power. Women wove blankets in the shade of its orchards, while men stood watch atop the cliffs, their eyes scanning for the dust of approaching soldiers. Yet, this fortress would soon face an assault that would scar the Navajo soul. The Navajo homeland, known as Dinéta, was a vast expanse defined by 4 sacred mountains. Whiteshell Mountain to the east, Blue Bead Mountain to the south, Abalone Shell Mountain to the west, and Big Sheep Mountain to the north. These peaks, standing as pillars of Navajo cosmology, framed a land of roughly 27,000 square miles in the Four Corners region. According to Navajo creation stories, as documented by ethnographer Washington Matthews in 1897, the Diné emerged through 5 worlds, their final home crafted within these mountains by the holy people. Every river, mesa, and valley held meaning, binding the Navajo to their land. This sacred geography shaped their identity, making the threat of exile a wound deeper than any physical loss. Chaco Canyon, a sprawling complex of ancient stone dwellings, lay at the heart of Dinéta's spiritual legacy. By the 19th century, its great houses, some with over 600 rooms, stood as silent witnesses to a civilization that thrived from 850 to 1150 AD. Navajo oral history, as cited by archaeologist David Stewart, claims kinship with the ancestral Puebloans who built Chaco, a center for trade and ceremony. The Diné saw themselves as stewards of this sacred site, their stories linking their migration to the canyon's exodus around 1150 AD, when drought drove its people outward. For the Navajo, Chaco was not just ruins but a living connection to their past, its presence reinforcing their claim to Dinéta. The San Juan River, its waters carving through Dinéta, and the Chusca Mountains, with their serene alpine lakes, formed a landscape of breathtaking beauty and spiritual weight. The San Juan, stretching over 400 miles, was a lifeline for Navajo herders, its banks supporting crops and livestock. The Chusca Range, rising to 9,000 feet, held sacred springs where ceremonies were conducted, as noted by anthropologist Charlotte Frisbee. These features were not mere geography but divine gifts, integral to Navajo rituals and survival. By the 1840s, an estimated 10,000 Navajo sheep grazed these lands, their wool sustaining a thriving economy. This sacred terrain anchored the Diné, making any threat to it a direct assault on their way of life. Hogan homes, crafted from earth and timber, were the soul of Navajo family life, each one a sacred space. A typical hogan, about 20 feet in diameter, housed extended families, its door facing east to greet the dawn. Women, central to Navajo culture, tended hearths within, their hands shaping clay or weaving wool, while ku, or sheep, were revered as life itself. As historian Peter Iverson writes, sheep meant survival, identity, and continuity for the Navajo. By 1860, the Dene owned over 100,000 churro sheep, their herds sustaining both sustenance and trade. The hogan, with its smoke rising through a central hole, was a microcosm of Deneta, tying families to the land and to each other. By the 1840s, the Navajo's prosperity drew the attention of settlers in Santa Fe, a bustling hub of 5,000 residents under Mexican rule. The Dene, with their vast herds and intricate blankets sold for up to $50 each, a fortune at the time, were envied by Hispanic and Anglo newcomers. Their weavings, dyed with natural hues from plants like indigo, were prized across New Mexico. Yet, as historian Frank McNitt observes, this wealth sparked resentment, with settlers viewing Navajo success as a challenge to their own ambitions. Raids and counter-raids escalated, setting the stage for conflict. The Navajo, ambitious and industrious, mirrored the settlers they clashed with, a bitter irony of shared traits fueling division. Navajo leader Armijo, his voice heavy with grief, spoke of the slave raids that plagued his people in the early 1800s. "My people are crying for the children they have lost," he said, as over 200 Navajo youths were kidnapped by Spanish and Mexican raiders, often sold in markets as far as Mexico City. These raids, documented by historian James Brooks, targeted women and children, with captors profiting up to $200 per enslaved person. The Dene retaliated, raiding settlements to reclaim their kin, but few were ever returned. This cycle of violence, rooted in greed, scarred Navajo families, fostering a deep mistrust of outsiders that lingered into the American era. European exploration, sparked by Hernán Cortés's conquest of Mexico in 1519, brought upheaval to the southwest. By the 1600s, Spanish colonizers, with their steel swords and horses, had claimed New Mexico, home to an estimated 50,000 native people, including the Navajo. The Dene, encountering Spaniards in the 1700s, faced forced labor and missionization, as historian David Weber details. Smallpox and other diseases, introduced by Europeans, decimated native populations, reducing some tribes by 90%. For the Navajo, these encounters were not just physical but spiritual violations, their land and freedom increasingly under siege as European ambitions grew. The 1804 expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, traversing 8,000 miles to the Pacific, marked a turning point for Native nations. Commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, their journey mapped the West for American expansion, signaling the approach of Anglo settlers. For the Navajo, still distant from these explorers, the expedition's ripple effects were profound. As historian Stephen Ambrose notes, Lewis and Clark's voyage opened the floodgates of manifest destiny. By the 1840s, American traders and soldiers reached Deneta, their presence a grim foreshadowing of the trials that would culminate in the Long Walk. A tragedy born of unrelenting expansion. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain, ending over 2 centuries of colonial rule in the Southwest. Yet, for the Navajo, this shift brought no relief. Under Mexican control, New Mexico remained a hotbed of violence, with slave raids targeting Navajo communities. An estimated 200 to 300 Navajo children were kidnapped annually, as historian Andres Resendez documents, sold into servitude as far as Mexico City. Navajo warriors, armed with bows and lances, struck back, raiding Mexican villages to reclaim their kin. This cycle of retribution, fueled by greed and desperation, deepened the scars on Deneta. By 1846, when Mexico's grip on the region faltered, the Navajo stood on the brink of a new and even greater challenge: American expansion. The Mexican-American War, raging from 1846 to 1848, reshaped the Southwest forever. General Stephen Watts, Kearny, leading the Army of the West, marched into Santa Fe, claiming New Mexico for the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, ceded 1.2 million square miles of land, including the Navajo homeland, to American control. This vast territory, larger than France and Spain combined, was home to over 12,000 Navajos, who saw Dineta as their sacred birthright. Historian Howard Lamar notes, "The treaty marked a turning point, placing native lands under a nation driven by expansionist zeal. For the Navajo, their sovereignty was now at the mercy of a distant government, its eyes fixed on the West." In the 18th of November 44, James Polk's election as the 11th U.S. president ignited the fervor of manifest destiny, a belief that Americans were destined to conquer the continent. Polk, a wiry Tennessean with a relentless vision, campaigned on annexing Texas and Oregon, his speeches rallying settlers to claim the West. By 1846, an estimated 10,000 American pioneers were streaming into the Southwest, their wagons laden with dreams of land and wealth. Historian Bernard DeVoto writes, "Manifest destiny was less a policy than a fever, blinding settlers to the cost of their ambition. For the Navajo, this ideology cast them as obstacles, their homeland a prize to be seized in the name of progress." General Stephen Watts Kearny, a stern officer with a neatly trimmed beard, rode into New Mexico in 1846, his saber gleaming at his side. Commanding 1,700 troops, he promised to protect peaceful inhabitants from tribes like the Navajo, whom he branded as enemies. His proclamation, issued in Santa Fe, offered security to Hispanic residents, but none to the Diné. Kearny's forces, clad in blue wool uniforms, patrolled Navajo lands, their presence a constant threat. As historian David Roberts observes, Kearny's words were a veneer of justice, masking a campaign to subdue native resistance. The Navajo, unaware of Washington's plans, faced a new adversary whose promises rang hollow. In 1851, the U.S. Army erected Fort Defiance on the southern edge of Dineta, its wooden stockades rising amid Navajo grazing lands. Housing 300 soldiers, the fort was a deliberate provocation, built to curb Navajo raids on Hispanic settlements. By 1855, tensions boiled over, with Navajo warriors clashing with troops over stolen livestock. An estimated 50 skirmishes occurred between 1851 and 1860, as reported by military records, each side blaming the other for escalating violence. Historian Jennifer Nez Dennetdale argues, "Fort Defiance was a symbol of conquest, its very name a challenge to Navajo autonomy. For the Diné, the fort's shadow loomed as a grim reminder of their shrinking freedom." End of 782. Argue, endoflow.com. In 1862, General James Henry Carleton, a 48-year-old career soldier, took command of New Mexico's military district. A man of sharp intellect, Carleton sat at his desk in Santa Fe, his quill scratching out plans to subdue the Navajo. He believed a decisive campaign was essential to end their raids, which he claimed cost settlers $100,000 annually in livestock. Carleton's letters, preserved in military archives, reveal a man driven by both duty and delusion, convinced that Navajo resistance threatened American progress. Historian Mark Simmons notes, "Carleton saw himself as a savior, yet his vision ignored the Navajos' deep ties to their land. His ambition would soon unleash a tragedy of staggering scale." Carleton, once a literary enthusiast in Boston, dreamed of transforming the Navajo into settled farmers, a vision tinged with naivety and greed. He believed, without evidence, that Dineta held vast gold deposits, a fantasy that fueled his resolve. In his reports, Carleton described a reservation at Bosque Redondo where the Navajo would adopt Pueblo-style agriculture. This plan, rooted in federal policies of assimilation, aimed to erase Navajo nomadism. As historian Peter Iverson writes, "Carleton's dream was a mirage, built on ignorance of Navajo culture and ecology. His obsession with control blinded him to the human cost of his experiment, setting the stage for suffering. Colonel Kit Carson, a weathered frontiersman at 53, led Carleton's campaign against the Navajo in 1862. Known for his buckskin jacket and steady gaze, Carson rode across Denata with 700 volunteers, his orders clear: break the Navajo without mass slaughter. Instead of battles, he targeted their lifeline, burning hogans and fields. By 1863, Carson's men had destroyed over 2,000 homes, as military logs confirm, forcing families into the open. Historian Hampton Sides observes, Carson was a reluctant destroyer, torn between duty and morality. Yet, his actions, however conflicted, would devastate the Navajo, proving destruction could be as cruel as bloodshed. In 1863, Carson's scorched earth policy swept through Denata, leaving fields in ashes. On the 19th of August, he reported destroying 70 acres of corn and 50 acres of wheat, enough to feed hundreds of Navajo families. His troops, wielding torches, moved systematically, their boots trampling crops as women and children watched in despair. The campaign, costing $1 million, aimed to starve the Navajo into submission, a tactic Carleton deemed humane compared to outright war. Historian David Roberts calls it a calculated cruelty, impoverishing a people to break their will. By winter, hunger gripped Denata, pushing the Navajo toward a breaking point. Canyon de Chelly, the Navajo's spiritual stronghold, bore the brunt of Carson's wrath in 1864. Its orchards, home to an estimated 3,000 peach trees, were razed, their branches hacked and burned. The canyon's red waters, once a symbol of life, ran past smoldering fields. Navajo families, huddled in caves, saw their economic heart destroyed, with losses valued at $200,000 in modern terms. As anthropologist Ruth Underhill records, the destruction of the orchards was a wound to the Navajo soul, severing ties to their sacred mother. This assault, more than any other, signaled the collapse of Navajo resistance, paving the way for exile. On the 20th of July, 1863, General James Henry Carleton issued a chilling ultimatum from his Santa Fe headquarters, his pen steady as he wrote. After this date, every Navajo who did not surrender would be treated as hostile, subject to capture or death. To entice compliance, he promised food, clothing, and shelter at a distant reservation called Bosque Redondo. By this time, an estimated 12,000 Navajos faced starvation after Kit Carson's scorched earth campaign destroyed their crops and livestock. Historian Mark Simmons writes, Carleton's order was a trap, offering survival at the cost of exile. Desperate families, clutching tattered blankets, began to gather at Fort Defiance, their eyes heavy with fear and resignation, forced to choose between hunger and leaving their sacred Denata. The Long Walk, as the Navajo would later call it, began in the 18th of August 63, a series of forced marches that tore families from their homeland. Archaeologist Dr. Neil Ackerley documented 53 separate journeys, with groups ranging from 20 to 2,400 people, stretching over months. The largest march, in the 18th of March 64, saw 2,400 Navajos herded like cattle toward Bosque Redondo, 350 miles away. Military records note that Carleton's troops, numbering 1,000 Jepger, escorted these groups, their rifles glinting in the sun. As historian Jennifer Nez Denadale observes, the Long Walk was not a single event but a prolonged ordeal, each step a wound to Navajo identity. The Dene, once masters of their land, were now prisoners of a nation's ambition. Navajo men, women, and children trudged across Denata's rugged terrain, their feet bare and bleeding on frozen ground. Many wore only thin shawls or scraps of cloth, patched from years of use, as they faced blizzards and scorching deserts. The journey, spanning over 350 miles, crossed mountains and rivers, with no rest for the weary. By late 1863, an estimated 8,000 Navajos had begun this trek, their belongings reduced to what they could carry. Military reports describe children clinging to mothers, their faces gaunt from hunger. Historian Peter Iverson notes, the physical toll was matched by spiritual anguish, as the Navajo left behind their sacred mountains. Each mile deepened their despair, yet they walked on, driven by faint hopes of survival. On the 6th of March, 1864, Captain A.B. Carey, stationed at Fort Canby, penned a grim report. In the past month alone, 126 Navajos had died at his post, victims of cold, disease, and exhaustion. In total, he estimated 2,263 Navajos had been removed from their homeland, a number that stunned even the military. Carey's log, preserved in the National Archives, details the toll. Infants succumbed to frostbite, elders collapsed under the weight of hunger, and entire families vanished in the snow. As historian David Roberts writes, "The Long Walk was a death march, its casualties a testament to calculated cruelty." These numbers, stark and unyielding, reveal the human cost of Carleton's vision, a policy that broke bodies as easily as it broke spirits. The weakest among the Navajo faced a fate even more brutal. Pregnant women and elders, struggling to keep pace, were often pulled aside by soldiers, their blue coats stark against the snow. Survivors, their voices trembling in oral histories, recall hearing gunshots echo from behind rocks, signaling execution. One account, recorded by ethnographer Ruth Underhill, describes a mother, heavy with child, dragged away as her family screamed. Military orders, as noted by historian Hampton Sides, permitted such acts to maintain the march's pace. Efficiency trumped humanity, Sides argues, and the Navajo paid the price. These killings, though few in number, seared themselves into Navajo memory, a wound that would not heal. The Rio Grande, its waters swollen and icy, became a grave for many Navajos. In early 1864, as groups crossed its 200-yard span, the current swept away those too weak to resist. Survivors spoke of seeing hands, feet, or strands of hair floating downstream, the last traces of loved ones. An estimated 100 Navajos drive owned in these crossings, according to military estimates, their screams haunting those who reached the far bank. The Diné, unaccustomed to deep rivers in their arid homeland, were unprepared for such perils. Historian Andrés Resendez writes, "The Rio Grande was not just a barrier but a symbol of loss, swallowing lives as it divided families. For the Navajo, each loss was a thread torn from their communal fabric." By the end of the Long Walk, an estimated 2,500 Navajos had perished, a staggering toll that accounted for nearly one-fifth of their population. Cold, starvation, and disease claimed many, but violence also took its share. Ute, Pueblo, and New Mexican raiders, exploiting the chaos, attacked stragglers, stealing children and livestock. Military escorts, stretched thin with only 10 soldiers per 100 Navajos, could not protect the vulnerable. Historian James Brooks estimates that 500 Navajos were kidnapped during the marches, sold into slavery for $150 each. The Long Walk was a gauntlet, Brooks notes, where survival was a daily battle. The Navajo, stripped of their herds and homes, faced a relentless enemy in despair itself. Manuelito, a Navajo warrior towering over 6 feet 3 inches, embodied the spirit of resistance. Clad in a woven blanket and armed with a bow, he led 30 warriors near Navajo Mountain, evading capture through 1863. His presence, commanding and resolute, inspired hope among the Diné. Military reports describe him as a formidable adversary, his raids on army outposts a defiance of Carleton's power. Historian Frank McNitt writes, "Manuelito was the Navajos' last stand, a symbol of their unyielding will. While thousands surrendered, he and his band hid in Dinéta's remote mesas, their fires burning low to avoid detection, a testament to the strength of Navajo resolve." Not all Navajos faced the Long Walk. Some, numbering in the thousands, found refuge in the labyrinthine chasms of the Grand Canyon or the stark highlands of Monument Valley. These holdouts, often women and elders, survived on roots and small game, their knowledge of the land their shield. An estimated 3,000 Navajos evaded capture, as oral histories recount, Their stories of survival passed down through generations. Historian Jennifer Nez Denadale notes, "These resistors preserved Navajo culture, their defiance a quiet victory. Hidden in Dineta's rugged heart, they kept the flame of their identity alive, a legacy that would outlast their pursuers." Bosque Redondo, known to the Navajo as Huelte, sprawled across 160 square miles along the Pecos River, its cottonwood trees a deceptive promise of refuge. By 1864, over 8,000 Navajos arrived, their bodies worn and spirits broken. The reservation's alkaline water, drawn from the Pecos, was barely potable, causing illness among the captives. Resources, meant for 3,000 people, were stretched thin, with only 10,000 pounds of flour allocated monthly. Historian Peter Iverson writes, "Bosque Redondo was a prison, its barren plains a mockery of Navajo dreams. For the Dene, this alien land, far from their sacred mountains, was a place of despair, where survival hung by a thread." By 1864, Bosque Redondo groaned under the weight of over 8,500 Navajos and 400 Mescalero Apaches, a human tide that overwhelmed General Carleton's expectations. He had planned for 3,000 to 4,000 captives, but the reality was a chaotic mass of starving families, their gaunt faces etched with despair. The 18th of December 64 military report counted 8,569 Navajos alone, crammed into a 160 square mile reservation meant for far fewer. Supplies, including 12,000 pounds of beef monthly, ran dry within weeks, leaving children to scavenge for scraps. Historian Mark Simmons writes, "Bosque Redondo was a catastrophe, its overcrowding a monument to Carleton's hubris. For the Navajo, this was no sanctuary but a prison, its barren plains mocking their dreams of Dineta." The food at Bosque Redondo was a poison to the Navajo, unaccustomed to the Army's rations of rancid bacon, white flour, and green coffee beans. These staples, stored in damp warehouses, often arrived spoiled, triggering waves of dysentery and diarrhea. An estimated 1,000 Navajos died from disease in 1864 alone, as military logs grimly record, their bodies buried in shallow graves along the Pecos River. Women, clutching sick infants, tried to grind the unfamiliar flour, their hands trembling from hunger. Historian Andres Resendez notes, "The rations were not just inadequate, but deadly, a cruel irony for a people promised salvation. The Dene, once sustained by corn and mutton, now faced death in every bite. Wood, scarce in Bosque Redondo's stark landscape, vanished quickly as thousands sought warmth. By 1865, Navajos had burned their sacred hogans, each log a piece of their identity reduced to ash. When timber ran out, families dug holes in the earth, covering them with tattered canvas to shield against freezing winds. An Army survey reported that 70% of Navajo dwellings were these makeshift pits by 1866, housing up to 10 people each." Historian Peter Iverson writes, "The loss of hogans was a spiritual amputation, stripping the Navajo of their cultural anchor. In these crude shelters, the Dene huddled, their breath visible in the cold, clinging to memories of Dineta's warmth. The soldiers at Bosque Redondo, tasked with guarding the captives, often became their tormentors. Navajo women, some as young as 15, were taken to officers' quarters, used as sex slaves under threat of violence. Military records, though sparse, document complaints of such abuses, with no officers disciplined. The Mescalero Apaches faced even harsher treatment, locked in stockades and beaten for minor infractions. One Apache elder, quoted by historian James Brooks, recalled, "We were warriors, reduced to groveling in the dirt. The Navajo endured in silence, their dignity battered but unbroken." As historian Jennifer Nez Denadale notes, "Their suffering was a testament to their resilience, even in the face of inhumanity." Agriculture, Carleton's grand vision for Bosque Redondo, crumbled under nature's wrath. Crops of corn and wheat, planted on 2,000 acres, were devoured by locusts and withered by drought. In 1865, the harvest yielded only 500 bushels, enough to feed 1,000 people for a month, far short of the 9,000 captives' needs. The Pecos River, too alkaline for irrigation, poisoned what little grew. Military reports estimate $200,000 spent on failed farming efforts, a fortune in 1860s dollars. Historian David Roberts argues, Bosque Redondo was a delusion, its fields a graveyard for Navajo hopes. The Diné, skilled herders, were no farmers, and Carleton's dream left them starving amid dust. In the 18th of November 65, the Mescalero Apaches, numbering about 400, vanished from Bosque Redondo under cover of night. Slipping past sleeping guards, they fled west, their moccasins silent on the cold earth. By dawn, their absence stunned the army, which lacked the manpower to pursue them. An estimated 90% of the Mescaleros reached their homeland, never to return. Military logs note the escape as a failure of control, but historian Hampton Sides writes, the Mescaleros' flight was a rebuke to Carleton's arrogance, proof that freedom could not be caged. For the Navajo, left behind, the escape was a spark of hope, a reminder that resistance could triumph. Manuelito, the towering Navajo leader, could no longer outrun his pursuers by 1866. At 6 feet 3 inches, his presence had once rallied warriors, but relentless army patrols numbering 500 troops wore him down. In September, he surrendered at Fort Wingate, his woven blanket draped over slumped shoulders, his 30 warriors at his side. His capture, reported in the Santa Fe Gazette, marked the end of organized Navajo resistance. Historian Frank McNitt notes, Manuelito's surrender was a bitter necessity, but his spirit remained unbroken. For the Diné, his fall was a heavy blow, yet his legacy as a symbol of defiance endured, even in defeat. In 1867, a peace commission, led by General William Tecumseh Sherman, arrived at Bosque Redondo to assess its failure. Sherman, a grizzled Civil War veteran with a stern gaze, toured the reservation, his boots sinking into mud. He found 9,000 captives living in squalor, with 1,500 deaths recorded that year from disease and starvation. The commission's report, submitted to Congress, pegged annual costs at $1.5 million, an unsustainable burden. Historian Mark Simmons writes, Sherman saw a humanitarian disaster, its misery, a stain on American policy. The Navajo, their eyes hollow, awaited a verdict that would decide their fate, their hope flickering like a candle in the wind. In May 1868, Navajo leader Barbanchito stood before Sherman, his voice steady despite years of hardship. Clad in a woven sash, he spoke for his people. I hope to God you will not ask me to go to any other country except my own. His words, recorded by the commission, pierced the room, a plea rooted in the Navajo's sacred bond with Dineta. An orator of rare power, Barbancito recounted the lies of Bosque Redondo's promises, his hands gesturing to the barren land. Historian Jennifer Nez Denadale argues, Barbancito's speech was a masterstroke, blending desperation with dignity. Sherman, moved despite his hardened demeanor, began to question the reservation's purpose, swayed by a leader's unyielding love for home. The Treaty of 1868, signed on the 1st of June, marked a turning point for the Navajo. It granted them a 3.5 million acre reservation within Dineta, recognizing their sovereignty. In the 7th of June, 000 Navajos began their return, a 10-mile-long procession of weary but hopeful souls. Families carried what little they had, their moccasins worn thin as they walked toward their sacred mountains. The treaty, costing the U.S. $100,000 in supplies, was a rare concession to a native nation. Historian Peter Iverson writes, the treaty was a Navajo victory, proof that endurance could outlast oppression. For the Diné, the journey home was a rebirth, their tears mingling with the promise of a new dawn. As the Navajo trekked home in the 18th of June 68, their eyes caught the faint outline of Blue Bead Mountain, one of their 4 sacred peaks. Men, women, and children, Their faces weathered by years of exile dropped to their knees, pressing their lips to the earth in reverence. Tears streamed down as they touched the soil of Dineta, a land they had feared lost forever. An estimated 7,000 Navajos, stretching 10 miles in a ragged procession, carried bundles of meager belongings, their moccasins worn to threads. Historian Peter Iverson writes, "This was the long walk home, a moment of spiritual renewal born from unimaginable loss." For the Dene, the sight of their mountain was a promise kept, a testament to their unbreakable bond with their homeland. The Treaty of 1868, while a triumph, came with strings attached. It mandated education for Navajo children aged 6 to 16, a clause that birthed a new ordeal. Boarding schools. The Carlisle Indian School, opened in Pennsylvania in 1879, became the model for this policy, enrolling 10,605 Native Street Utes from 1879 to 1918. Navajo children, some as young as 6, were sent 2,000 miles from Dineta, their woven blankets traded for stiff uniforms. The school's mission, as historian David Wallace Adams notes, was to civilize Native youth, erasing their culture to mold them into American citizens. For the Navajo, this was a second exile, trading Bosque Redondo's physical chains for the psychological shackles of assimilation. At Carlisle, Navajo children faced a brutal regimen designed to strip their identity. Speaking their native tongue was forbidden, and those who dared were punished harshly. Teachers forced soap into their mouths, the bitter taste a lesson in silence. One Navajo student, quoted by historian Brenda Child, recalled, "I sucked on brown soap until my throat burned, just for whispering my name in Diné." Physical discipline was common, with yardsticks cracking across knuckles or heads. By 1885, 43 Navajo Street Utes had enrolled, their long braids shorn, their spirits battered. The school was a battlefield. Child writes, where culture was the enemy. Yet, the Navajo children clung to fragments of their heritage, whispering prayers in secret. Richard Henry Pratt, Carlisle's founder, coined a chilling slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." A former cavalry officer, Pratt, with his clipped beard and rigid posture, enforced this creed with military precision. Navajo students were given Anglo names like Betty or John, their traditional names erased from records. Their hair, a symbol of pride, was cropped short, and they were dressed in starched collars, alien to their woven tunics. Photographs of Navajo student Tom Torlino, taken in 1882, show a transformation from a proud Diné youth to a westernized figure, his eyes dulled by conformity. Historian Margaret Jacobs argues Pratt's vision was cultural genocide, cloaked in benevolence. For the Navajo, this was a war on their very soul. Defiance flickered among Navajo students, many of whom fled Carlisle's oppressive walls. By 1900, an estimated 20% of Native students attempted escape, some Navajo among them. They braved freezing nights, hiding in forests or along railroads, desperate to return to Dineta. Tragically, some perished, their bodies found frozen or crushed by trains. One Navajo runaway, documented by historian David Adams, died in a snowdrift, clutching a woven bracelet from home. Escape was their loudest protest, Adams writes, a rejection of a system that sought to erase them. These acts of resistance, though costly, proved the Navajo spirit could not be fully subdued, even in the face of such cruelty. Manuelito, the towering Navajo leader, embraced education as a path forward. A decision that brought heartbreak. In 1882, he sent 2 sons and a nephew to Carlisle, hoping they would learn skills to navigate the Anglo world. Tragically, all 3 died. One at the school, the others from tuberculosis contracted there, their bodies returned to Dineta in pine coffins. By 1883, tuberculosis claimed 10% of Carlisle's students, its cramped dorms breeding disease. Historian Frank McNitt writes, Manuelito's loss was a wound to the Navajo nation, proof that education came at a terrible price. Yet, Manuelito's vision endured, his sacrifice a painful step toward a future where the Diné could thrive on their own terms. By the early 20th century, the boarding school model began to shift. Schools like the Intermountain Indian School, opened in Utah in 1950, allowed Navajo children to stay closer to Dinéta. Serving 2,000 students until its closure in 1984, Intermountain offered a less brutal environment, with Navajo language classes permitted by the 1970s. Families, once wary of schools after Carlisle's horrors, began to see education as a tool, not a weapon. Historian Brenda Child notes, local schools healed some of the scars, letting Navajo children learn without losing their identity. For the Diné, this was a quiet victory, reclaiming education as a means to strengthen, not erase, their culture. Dan Begay, a Navajo elder, carried the weight of boarding school trauma into adulthood. As a child in the 1950s, he endured beatings for speaking Diné, his ears ringing from teachers' blows. Decades later, his anger surfaced in tears, until his wife urged him to release the past. "Those things happened long ago," she said, as recounted in oral histories. Begay's journey, shared by many Navajo survivors, reflects the long shadow of assimilation. Historian Margaret Jacobs writes, "The boarding school era left scars, but Navajo resilience turned pain into purpose." Begay's healing, rooted in family and culture, mirrors the broader Navajo story of overcoming through strength. The Long Walk remains a searing memory for the Navajo, its pain etched into their collective soul. Today, Diné families visit Bosque Redondo, bringing stones from Dinéta as tributes to ancestors who suffered there. An estimated 1,000 such stones, some carried 300 miles, lie at the site, a silent memorial to the 2,500 who died. Navajo ceremonies, as documented by anthropologist Charlotte Frisbee, honor these losses, weaving them into songs of endurance. The Long Walk is not just history, Frisbee notes, but a living wound tended by memory. For the Navajo, these pilgrimages are acts of love, ensuring their ancestors' sacrifices are never forgotten. The Navajo's endurance through the Long Walk and its aftermath forged a people destined for greatness, as historian Peter Iverson declares. From the ashes of Bosque Redondo, they rebuilt Dinéta, their reservation growing to 27,000 square miles by 2025, home to over 170,000 Navajos. Their weavings, once burned, now fetch thousands in global markets, and their language, once silenced, thrives in schools. Iverson writes, "The Navajo turned tragedy into triumph, their resilience a beacon for all native nations. The Diné, standing tall on their sacred land, embody a legacy of courage, their story a testament to the power of a people who refuse to be broken. The Navajo's triumph, rising from the ashes of the Long Walk, stands as a monument to their unyielding spirit. As they rebuilt Dinéta, their sacred stones at Bosque Redondo became symbols of endurance, each one a whisper of ancestors who faced starvation, exile, and cultural erasure yet held fast to their identity. Their homeland, now sprawling across 27,000 square miles, thrives with a culture that refused to be silenced, from vibrant weavings to songs in the Diné language." Historian Jennifer Nez Denadale writes, "The Navajo's story is one of survival, woven with pain but radiant with hope. Their legacy endures, a powerful reminder of a people who turned tears into a tapestry of resilience, forever rooted in the sacred earth of Dinéta."